All right, so we're going to get rolling, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our sixth and final session of our Science Communication Seminar Series. I'd like to make you aware of the closed captioning feature available on the Zoom call that can be activated by hitting the CC tab at the bottom of your screen. Please also be aware that we are recording the talk so that an accurate transcript can be generated afterwards. It would be appreciated if you could turn off your microphones during the session. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the talk. So as we get close to the end, please put your questions into the chat when the talk concludes. My name is Alison McDonald, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Biology at Wilfrid Laurier University. My co-organizer is Dr. Brittany Borowick, who is a postdoctoral scholar in the department. We'd like to thank the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, who's provided funding for our series, as well as the Department of Biology and the Laurier Centre for Women in Science, who are also sponsors of the program. I wish to acknowledge that in Waterloo, where I live, work, and play, it's located on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I want to thank those who have come before me as serving as stewards and protectors of the land. Canada is currently reflecting quite a bit on the true history of the country, and this will no doubt continue as more bodies are recovered on the grounds of residential schools. I personally will be spending the upcoming weeks and months determining how I can personally meet the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's reports. In particular, I will be reflecting on how my teaching practices and content need to change. Today's session is very exciting. It's all about careers in science communication, and we have three panelists today who are going to be talking about their personal experiences, their journeys, and how they ended up with careers in science communication. So I'm not actually going to spend a lot of time introducing them. I'm just going to turn it over to them one at a time. They've each prepared about 15 minutes, and then once everyone is done, we're going to open the floor to a hopefully very active question and answer session. So for now, I'm going to turn things over to our first panelist, who is Kurtis.
Okay. Can everyone see that? That works? Thumbs up, maybe? All right. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Kurtis Baute. I run a YouTube channel, a science YouTube channel, and I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm on the land of the Comox First Nations in British Columbia. So I'm going to be talking about my winding path as a science YouTuber. And it starts way back when YouTube started back in 2007. I've been making YouTube videos since it began, but I've been making videos since as long as I could get my hands on a camera, which was hard back in the day. We had to use tapes, okay? This is a long time ago. Things have changed a lot. It's so much more accessible now to be able to make videos. You can pull out your smartphone and you have 4K on hand. When I started making videos, it was just all fictional, weird skits. So my first YouTube video was me chasing myself around a building. Like my reflection escaped a mirror and chased me around. It was weird, but so I'd been making videos for a long time, like from early days, and I was also entering film festivals. A high school teacher of mine said, "Hey, this video that you put on YouTube, you should enter it into a film festival, a subset of the Toronto International Film Festival," and it won, and it was a big deal for me because it was like, wow, I've always loved doing this, and it turns out people like what I'm doing. So it really got me hooked right from the start. And I went to Ryerson University to do a new media studies undergrad. That's how it started. I really quickly learned that Ryerson just wasn't for me, and I transferred to communication studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. And I was in that for a year before I realized, after reading a book called The Selfish Gene, which is about genetics, I realized that science actually turns out to be really awesome. And up until this point, I hated science. I never really realized that I always thought it was just a collection of facts. It was just about learning and memorizing things. But when I read that book, The Selfish Gene, it made me think, oh, wow, it's a way of seeing the world. It's a way of looking at things and understanding them. And it's a process, not a tomb of knowledge. And so at that, I really rapidly changed gears yet again. And I dove full on into science, and I switched in my majors into becoming did a Bachelor of Arts in Biology with a Communication Studies minor. So this is sort of my shift in view. And even from this stage, I really wanted to continue making videos, and I wanted to specifically share my newfound passion with science with everyone. Because I realized, like, wow, most people don't understand what it's like to know what science is about. And I think it can really improve the world. So back in 2010, I finished my undergrad in 2012, or I guess it would have been, yeah, finished my undergrad in 2012. Seems like a long time ago now. And then I started my master's at the University of Guelph. And I was studying bioenergy. I was studying renewable biogas. But during this time, I started making science videos for the first time, because I hadn't really done that. I'd only made fictional skits up until this point. And so again, thinking about contests, something I'd been doing, and something that there are a lot of film contests. I entered in a contest at my university. It was looking for the ideal university. And I entered a skit that I filmed on my laptop, because that was the only camera that I had at the time, my little webcam on my laptop. And I carried the laptop all around the university and put it on chairs and filmed this video and submitted it to this contest. And luckily, I won it. Luckily, I say, because there were only like 6 other entries. And what that meant was they sent me an iPad, because that was the award, which was great, but I didn't want an iPad, I wanted a camera. So I sold the iPad and I bought a camera. And then I started making more science videos. And I quickly entered another contest. In 2014, I made a music video of my master's thesis. I called it Tall Grass Biomass for Biogas. It was very funny, very simple overview of the work that I was doing. If it didn't rhyme with gas, it didn't make the cut in terms of vocabulary. It needed to be pretty simple. And so I made this video for a contest that was called Science Slams. And it entered me into a contest that's like, I won that round and entered the next level and did a live presentation in Toronto. And then I won that. And I won a trip to Europe to do a science communication, I guess, like tour. And we did a science communication course in Belgium and in Germany, which was like amazing. And I got to meet all of these other communicators, and I got to learn more about communicating science. And at this point, I really thought, wow, like, this is really fun. I wish there was a way to make a living out of this. But at the time, there kind of wasn't. Science YouTuber or YouTuber was still kind of a new thing that I hadn't really considered doing. But I knew I loved making videos. So over the next couple of years, the next 4 years, I made a lot of videos. I was working part-time at 2 different places, at Science World, which is like a science communication facility in Vancouver. And I was working at Brain Boost Education, which is a tutoring company also in Vancouver. So I was teaching science mostly to kids full-time between these 2 jobs. And then on Friday afternoons or on the weekend, I would try to make little simple videos. And I made so many of them, and most of them were not very good. And I think that is maybe a critical lesson that you can take away from this little presentation, which is that I didn't become competent in this overnight. It took a lot of failures, but that's how you learn. Some of the things that I've learned while doing this is just to create like no one is watching, because frankly, they probably aren't. The vast majority of all of these videos only had maybe a couple hundred views, usually just a few dozen views. You know, people weren't watching, but that was okay. I was learning to just do what I wanted and to be myself and to learn to make these videos. I think people are actually drawn to that. Like they saw, I made that music video of my thesis thinking that, you know, maybe a dozen people would see it. And I was silly, and people saw it and they're like, this guy is, you know, he's just going for it. And that worked out well in my favor. Secondly, get started, you know, just go for it. You're not going to get good overnight. It took me a long time. It took me over 100 videos to learn what I wanted to do. It takes a lot of practice. it's specifically for science communication. I think it's important to remember that people are fundamentally smart. They just don't have science vocabulary. So if you're trying to explain a concept to them, don't use terms that they might not know. I try to use language that only a 5-year-old knows, but I don't dumb it down. Like even 5-year-olds, they're very smart. They just need to, you need to explain the words to them. Find the hook first. So I always start with thinking, okay, what's the title of this video going to be? What's going to draw people in? And then I build everything off of that. And lastly, and most importantly, storytelling is what it's all about, whether that's for a video, whether that's for any sort of presentation, anything. We are wired for story. So always start there. And there's a great book called Wired for Story that I can recommend to anyone that wants to do more science communication. So in 2018, I made a lot of videos and I kind of had learned a bit about how to make videos at this point. And I finally decided, hey, oh yeah, people are doing this as a career. People are doing science YouTube as a real thing. And like maybe I should try doing that. Like maybe this is right for me. And I decided to do a full year. I was very, very fortunate in that my parents basically floated me for a year to do this experiment. And I was going to say, okay, I'm going to start this, and in a year, if I can make it like sustainably, financially, then that's what I'm going to do. So for a full year, I did all of these really over-the-top projects because I thought that was the best way for me to sort of gain an audience on YouTube. So I biked across Saskatchewan with setting up 2 sundials, and I measured the shape of the Earth with my bike and 2 sticks, and I set up thousands, like 13,799 dominoes that I made by hand, set up all these dominoes to use as a timeline for the history of the universe. So each domino was 1 million years, because man, the universe is super, super old. And as I made the video, I was running alongside it, narrating everything that happened. And I sealed myself in a jar with several hundred plants to talk about climate change and talk about how we interact with the air we breathe. So I did all these really over-the-top projects. And now, after doing that last project I mentioned, I focus specifically on climate change because I think it's really the most critical issue of our time. So these projects also have changed my worldview, and it sort of evolves. It's a continually winding path for me. But over that first year, as you can see, this is my subscriber number over time, and it was basically a flat line. I started with 248 subscribers at the start of that year, and by the end of it, I had 5,000, which is not enough to make a living off of. But I had a collaboration with a YouTuber named Tom Scott, who has a huge YouTube channel, and I was just like, okay, that's going to come out early January. I'll wait to see what comes of that. It's my kind of last chance. I was thinking it's either going to work or I'm going to quit. But it changed everything for me, and just right off overnight, basically, I reached 100,000 subscribers, and it became something that I could do. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but YouTubers make money once they have an audience. Before that, there's not really anything to be made in it. But you can make money through all these things: YouTube ads, sponsorships, selling merchandise, talks. I relied mostly on Patreon. But anyway, you can make money eventually. But first and foremost, it's not, and especially with science YouTube, it's not about the money. You can't get there if you're just focused on the money. Science communicators are really undervalued. I know that's true for YouTube. We might hear from Alex and Farah about their fields, but it's probably similar. I do think that people are starting to realize that it is something we need to spend more funding on. We have all of this, the anti-vax movements and so on that have made that really, really clear right now. But yeah, we need people like this more than ever. And yeah, that's it for me. Thank you so much. I'll stop the screen share.
You're on mute, Allison.
Allison, yeah, okay.
Nice. Yep. 15 months of that and still gets me every time. Thank you, Kurtis. That was really cool. We're going to save all the questions to the end so that everybody can sort of address the questions as a panel. So we're going to move on to Farah now.
say, it's really hard to follow up with a science YouTuber who built an entire list of dominoes, which is wild, but I will do my best. Hi everyone, my name is Farah Qaiser and I'm very excited to be here today. Before I start, I do want to acknowledge that I'm tuning in from the Greater Toronto Area region, which is the traditional territory to many different Indigenous groups, including the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. If you don't know where you're currently living and working on, I recommend checking out Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada and nativeland.ca. I think Allison touched upon a lot of the important points, and just in the context of science communication, I would strongly recommend that we all kind of take a minute to think about how we can better collaborate and connect with the communities who are living here, and how we can make sure that our science communication is actually inclusive and includes voices of everyone, and whether we're the right messengers for the many initiative stories that we're writing or sharing. So food for thought for today. My name's Farah. I'm a researcher and science communicator. Currently, I wear 2 or more hats. I'm a genomics researcher at the University Health Network's Epilepsy Genetics Clinic, and I'm also a researcher at Evidence for Democracy. And while I was sitting and trying to think about what to say at this panel, I kind of realized that there's a lot that I've done over the years. So I'm going to take a different way of kind of sharing what I think is useful to think about if you're considering a career in science communication. So for me, science communication really started in my undergrad when I started writing for my campus newspaper. But over the years, I started exploring quite a few different things. I took part in a 3-minute thesis competition. I ended up co-founding a science policy group. I wrote and edited for different science media outlets. I've taken part in things like Scicomm Can, which is a workshop series to build Scicomm skills in graduate students. I've also been a graduate student, which is kind of an important part. I've edited Wikipedia, I've done a lot of talks and outreach. But each of these different experiences have really taught me different skills, and they've kind of led me to where I am today. So I thought actually for today, I would focus on 2 critical experiences that really shaped who I am. And one is science writing, and the second is science policy. So for me, as I mentioned, it kind of all started in undergrad. I didn't know what science communication was. I didn't know it was a field. I was just a young undergrad. I don't even know how old I was then, but I kind of showed up on the first day of school, and I remember there was a clubs fair. I went and tracked down my campus newspaper because I always had in my head that I really want to write for my campus newspaper. It's kind of one of those bucket list things. And that's what I started doing. I went to classes about molecular biology. I was at the University of Toronto's Mississauga campus, and in my spare time, I would write for the Medium, which was my campus newspaper. I tried writing for different sections. I tried news. It was very factual, very straight to the facts, and very tight deadlines. There was the arts section, which was more relaxed, was more flexible, and was more opinionated. And then there was the features section, which was really about profiling the efforts of students, professors, and just people working in so many different fields. And I kept writing throughout my first year, and I really enjoyed the features section. I enjoyed it so much that I actually decided that I would kind of run for the features editor role. And I don't know what it was, but at the end of the first year, I ran for this features editor role in the election, and people kind of elected a first-year student, which was wild to me. But it really changed how, I guess, the rest of my life went, because I spent 2 years as the features editor at the University of Toronto's campus newspaper, and I learned how to edit people's work. I learned how to kind of identify stories versus topics. I learned how to think of original ideas to pitch, and how to really guide student writers through this pitching process. So for example, one of the stories I wrote about was the story of Max's Big Ride, which was a story of a father and a son who were biking every summer from Hamilton to Ottawa in an effort to raise funds for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. The son of Andrew, Max, is actually living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So this was really a beautiful story of kind of both a human element of a father trying to raise funds and awareness for an important disease, as well as the importance of kind of fundraising for science, and how sometimes there isn't enough funding for the diseases and treatments that we care about, and you kind of have to do it yourself. And it's kind of from these stories that I slowly started building science communication skills. I didn't realize it, but all the fact checking, the editing, speaking to different people, looking at how people answered my questions. So some people were very open, some they were using jargon, they could really explain and break down their science, versus some folks were very jargon heavy and I just couldn't understand what was going on and I had to do extra research. And I kind of picked up on science communication skills that way. I actually realized it when I took part in a 3-minute thesis competition. I ended up winning. But as I got into grad school, I decided to open up and kind of explore different avenues for science writing. I wrote for outlets like Forbes and Massive. And these are some of the stories that I love and still surprised by. So during the pandemic, I wrote about how people are heading to Wikipedia for information in the pandemic. So this was like March 2020. There were about 3 or 4 million folks who were actually relying on Wikipedia for information on what's going on. And this ended up being viewed by over 10,000 folks. One of the wilder stories that I wrote for Massive Science was about how scientists try to make knives out of frozen human poo. I wrote the story in like 10 or 15 minutes. I did it because Britt is an editor at Massive Science. I did it because our editor-in-chief, editor-at-large, was kind of just like, this is a good story. Farah, do you want to write about it? I was like, okay, I don't think it's serious, but we can try this. And it's been read by over 5,000 or 6,000 folks. And it just really goes to show kind of just curiosity can spark people to read about stories that they would never thought they exist. This was a wild story. And I've also kind of written about discoveries made by Gardner Award laureates. And these writing and editing skills have really translated over to different aspects of what I'm doing. These days, I'm not writing as much in terms of short-term news pieces, but I'm thinking more about long-term pieces, more creative pieces, and kind of trying to fill in the gaps rather than being more immediate. But it's been really wild how starting from just writing for a campus newspaper to writing for media outlets internationally, and it kind of really goes to show that the skills that you build during undergrad and grad school really do go on to follow you everywhere. The second experience that really formed me was when I ran into this area called science policy. So with a lot of my science writing, I began to notice that the same issues were popping up. So this idea that there's a lack of diversity in science, that so much of science is jargon heavy, and that science doesn't seem to be playing a role in decision making. And as I kept writing, I kept going to talks, I kept going to workshops and events. And if you've been in the sciences long enough, you'll see the same issues pop up again and again. And there are a lot of folks who are doing the work to try and address this. But for me at that point in grad school, I was just like, what's happening and how can we actually go about enacting change? And that's when I ran into science policies, this idea that there's science for policy and there's policy for science. So science for policy is something we've seen or haven't seen as much in the pandemic. It's the idea that scientific evidence can kind of help inform decision making. So things like rising case counts or the number of new COVID-19 infections, the number of vaccination doses. These are things that politicians can use to make decisions. So things such as whether we need to reopen, what public health measures we need to enact. But there's also policy for science. So how can we use laws, regulations, and structures to better structure science? So how do we decide what's the best science to fund? How do we decide that if we want science to be open access, who's paying for that? How are publishers going to work with this? How is this all going to be structured? So this all came down to science policy. And as I kept learning more and more, I actually realized that there aren't a lot of science policy groups in Canada. And I ended up co-founding this group called the Toronto Science Policy Network at the University of Toronto. And it was basically founded as a platform for people to learn about and engage in science policy. And through workshops, public panels, talks, and advocacy initiatives, we've really focused on kind of teaching folks about skills that they need to succeed in the science policy space, as well as taking the chance to address the gaps that we see and make a change. I'm going to share 2 examples of science policy initiatives. So the first is Vote Science. This was a campaign that we ran in the 2019 federal election time to really advocate for science. We sat and we put together tools that Canadians could use to reach out to their MP candidates. So kind of an email template that they could just click and send to their MP candidates, postcards to send over to MP candidates, and really asking what are you going to do to support science? How are you prioritizing science in your election platform? I wish I wasn't saying this right now because I feel like we're definitely heading into another federal election. But this was a really interesting campaign because we ended up getting over 600 Canadians to contact their MP candidates. And it's clear that folks are interested in advocating for science. It's just that the tools aren't easy to access. So this was a really interesting science communication campaign from really thinking about what's the gap and how can we address it and make it easier for people to reach out and talk about science with their politicians. Another example of something we did at Toronto Science Policy Network was this COVID-19 graduate student survey. So if we go back 1 year, academic institutions were closing. It was really hard to figure out what was going on, whether your research was going to be impacted. And at the Toronto Science Policy Network, we're a group of many graduate students. So we were very confused about what was going on. We're just like, is this only happening at the University of Toronto? Is everything a mess? Are people thinking about grad students and their decisions? And as we kept thinking and talking about it, it was clear that this was a pretty big issue. So we actually ended up looking for, okay, who's doing work to address this? There were a lot of surveys looking at undergraduate students, but no one was actually looking at graduate students. So we decided to address the gap. A group of 17 students, we ended up developing a national bilingual survey, which we distributed between April to May. And we ended up analyzing questions so related to health and wellness, funding, research, how people were affected in terms of their teaching and courses. And this was really interesting because we had the chance to use what we knew as graduate students and our science communication skills to really advocate for students and the impacts the pandemic was happening for students all across Canada. We ended up being covered in places like Nature Career News, the Chemical Institute of Canada. And I think the Toronto Science Policy Network just really shows how coming together and doing things as a collective when it comes to science communication can sometimes have a broader impact than just one person alone. So today, in terms of science policy, so I'm a researcher at Evidence for Democracy, and you might be wondering, okay, Farah, you've just spent a lot of time talking about science communication, but how do communication skills come in handy to policy? Well, one of my first projects at Evidence for Democracy was actually to build a plain language toolkit. So I was working on something called the impact assessment process. It's this process that happens that whenever a company proposes that they're going to build something that impacts federal land, so a fishery, a mine, maybe a new road, it has to be assessed for what impacts it may have on the environment. And the company will do its research, it'll engage with different stakeholders, and it'll say, all right, here are all the impacts. And this is where the federal government comes in, and they will check and they will say, okay, this project could impact the land, this could impact the birds, and it's all very technical heavy science. If you ever check out an impact assessment report, it's about 300 pages long. And even me with a master's, I'm just sitting here like, this is long, this is hard to read, it's very jargon heavy. So my project as a researcher at E4D was to prepare a plain language kit to really provide federal experts with best practices in how they can communicate federal science, given that it's such jargon heavy language and they have very limited time to really put together any sort of plain language document. So that was one example of kind of using my science communication skills in the policy world. One project I'm working on right now is the Fundamental Science Review, or the NAILR report that you might know, which puts forward a number of recommendations to help improve Canada's science system, and I'm kind of reviewing recommendations. So in short, oh, there's one more thing. I do also serve in the Canada Chief Science Advisors Youth Council, so just flagging issues that are relevant to the science community, so to science communication, science policy, to someone like Dr. Mona Niemer, and flagging the issues that matter. So in short, I started off as someone who joined science just to explore research, to learn more about DNA and genomics. And today I kind of ended up putting together everything I love. So I do genomics research, I do science policy research, and I'm still taking part in science communication, whether it's through writing, outreach, or Wikipedia editing. It's a bit of an unconventional route. I think with science communication, you do have to kind of decide whether it's your science that's going to come first, whether it's your science communication that's going to come first, whether you want to be a hybrid or whether you want to go freelance. And for me, I really wanted to make sure I could find a way that I could make genomics, science communication, and policy work. So unconventional, but it has been very fun. I'll end here with saying thank you for listening and that I'm happy to take any questions afterwards.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Farah. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit and go to Alex next.
Thank you very much. Can everyone see my screen okay? Perfect. Thank you for the thumbs up. All right. Hi, everyone. I wanted to say a quick thank you to Brittany and Allison for inviting me today, and also a huge thank you to Farah and Kurtis for their incredible talks. I'm going to have to stop myself as either through listening to both of those. I was thinking of so many connections and parallels, and I think hopefully some of those will arise as I go through and talk about my particular Scicomm journey. I'm going to be talking about medical illustration. But the last thank you I also want to put out is to everybody here for coming today, for being interested in our respective Scicomm journeys, and for being willing to spend some time with us. So to start things off, I do want to tell you a little bit about myself. Some of it might not make sense yet. For example, what is medical illustration anyway? What do we do? I will get there, I promise, but we'll start with some more broad strokes. So I'm a Métis visual storyteller. I use he, him pronouns. And I'm actually calling in from London, Ontario. So I live and work on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapehoik, and the Attawandaron peoples. Currently, I work as a biomedical communications designer, which is a mouthful, for a service design firm called Bridgeable in Toronto. And I also work as a freelance medical illustrator. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing on for the presentation today. Feel free to ask questions about that other role when we get to the Q&A period as well. What this means is that, and in both roles really, I'm focused on the design of impactful and what I call empathetic experiences that empower users, that empower the folks who are going to be using those particular materials or looking at those particular materials. And that means essentially that I like to combine scientific research, illustration, and graphic design to translate what would be complex topics into compelling and understandable stories that resonate with those folks. And I primarily do that for patients, for caregivers, and for healthcare providers. So broadly, and I say broadly because it is a pretty big field, even though it is very niche, I would consider myself and would describe my career as a medical and scientific illustrator, animator, and visual communicator. The journey to becoming that was not something that I would consider particularly linear. And I think that's something that we've heard from both of the previous talks as well. I didn't enter into my undergrad at Mac in 2010 wanting to be a medical illustrator. I didn't even know that that job existed. In 2010, when I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I wanted to be a doctor, like 90% of most entry-level science students. And while for me, happily, I didn't pursue that path. There were a number of branching points, career paths that I considered and hurdles that I jumped over in terms of realizing that Scicomm was what I cared about and that it was something that I could turn into an actual career that I enjoy every day. So today I'm going to cover what parts of that process look like for me. It's going to be a little bit focused on my undergrad because I think that's where I sort of had that branching realization. It's going to cover how I eventually realized that science communication and science visualization was my vocation of sorts. And then I'll end off by talking a little bit about what medical illustration actually is. So as I previously mentioned, when I started my undergrad, I was at McMaster University. I was really confident that I was going to be a doctor. I enrolled in a program called Integrated Science, or ISci, which is a research and a problem-based learning program. And I loved it. And this was because we got to do a little bit of everything science related. You weren't necessarily pigeonholed into one discipline right off the bat. And a lot of the research projects that we did were applied learning and the content that we learned in small lectures of like 40 students, which was phenomenal for me. Doing this, though, reminded me that I did like science as a whole. I didn't necessarily want to focus on one thing. And at the same time, I saw the folks who were gunning for med school, and I didn't necessarily love that attitude. It wasn't something that resonated with me individually. So my doctor aspirations pretty quickly faded. And instead, because of the love that I seemed to have for learning about science very broadly, I thought I would be a researcher. Or not. While the idea of doing research forever, maybe going forward and doing my master's, a PhD, and eventually becoming a prof, seemed incredibly enticing for honestly 2 to 3 years. I eventually realized that this 100% was not for me, at least in this particular field. I realized that I did like science, but I didn't love some aspects of it. I didn't love the lab work. I didn't love the admin that was related to that lab work particularly. Essentially what I realized was that I loved talking about the research, but not actually doing it. And this is something that probably should have been my first clue as to what I could maybe do with my life. I did not realize it at the time. So instead I thought, okay, if not research, what do I do? This is where I actually backslid a little. I figured that since most of my volunteer lab work and my honors thesis was related to animals, and I do generally just love animals, that I could be a vet or not. Similarly to the other career paths that I've listed, and a lot of the ones that I considered but didn't necessarily throw onto the slide, being a veterinarian wasn't quite the right fit. I didn't realize this until the very end of my undergraduate thesis as I was completing my work with someone that you might recognize on slide. Brittany was a master's student at the time and a big help for my particular project. But in sort of going through all of these career paths and crossing all of them off, which was very frustrating at the time, I did realize something important. I didn't have a good idea of what I wanted to do, but I did know what I didn't like. And that can be insightful, and just as insightful as trying to figure out, what exactly you want to do in some cases. In examining what I didn't like about the sort of things that I thought I might want to do over the past several years of my undergrad, I realized what connected all of these sort of disparate thoughts was what I actually enjoyed. And that was learning and sharing the science and the research that I uncovered in doing all of that. It was Scicomm, although I didn't know it by that name at the time. I didn't know that that was a thing that I could do. And therein lied a little bit of a problem. But before I jump into that, looking back, the fact that Scicomm was something that I wanted to do really shouldn't have been a surprise. In my group projects, I was the one who always wanted to format presentations. I wanted to work on the reports and what they looked like. If I was given an opportunity, for example, a project where we had to design a children's science exhibit for electric fish, I pushed it as far as I could, made it Dr. Seuss themed. I even looked forward to making the figures for my thesis as opposed to doing anything else for it. So it should have been obvious. But again, I didn't know that that was a thing. I didn't know that Scicomm was something that I could actually pursue. And so that led me to this question. It was like, what am I going to be? I knew that Scicomm was what got me going. It got me excited, but it didn't solve my career problem. I knew I wanted to communicate science. And I specifically knew that I liked communicating science visually so that it was engaging and so that it was accessible. But what does that look like for a job? Where do I go to do that? The answer was not obvious. And in truth, I actually feel really, really lucky. I may have stumbled upon an answer with Google eventually, and doing that did help me consider a number of other paths that are related to science communication. One of the big ones was the science communication program that they run at Laurentian. But where I actually found what I wanted to do was just stumbling through a craft fair. I noticed that there was a table that looked a little bit different from the others, and that advertised a program that's a little bit different from the others. And that was the Masters of Science in Biomedical Communications, which I'm just going to call BMC because it's much easier to say, at U of T, specifically at UTM. In a nutshell, BMC is a 2-year professional program that trains and prepares students to communicate science visually. It preps you to be a medical illustrator. It's definitely not the only way to do that, and that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later as well. But it does offer a mix of science and art courses. So you're learning hardcore anatomy, neuroanatomy, biochemistry, all while being taught how to use the Adobe suite or 3D programs like Cinema 4D and Maya to visualize complex science topics. So all of this seemed perfect for me, which was awesome. But in 2014, when I was just wrapping up my undergrad, there was still sort of one last problem to hurdle, and that leads to the wibbly wobbly part of that timeline I showed at the beginning. And that was that there was a pretty big skill gap in one of the areas that I needed to succeed as a medical illustrator. And this relates back to what Kurtis was talking about practice. So BMC relies on 2 sort of foundational aspects of knowledge for students. The first is pretty easy. You need to have a background in science. either an undergraduate degree or pre-rep courses that are going to set you up for success in understanding those complex topics. The second was sort of where my issue was. They required a certain level of artistic skill that I just didn't have. I wasn't bad at the time. I think I could communicate science well visually, but it wasn't where I needed to be to excel at the program. And so I needed to look elsewhere in terms of building that skill and closing that gap so that I could succeed in the program. And the way to solve this, Kurtis already talked about, and it is pretty basic, but it does explain that wibbly wobbly part of the timeline. I needed to practice. I needed time to develop my skills and get better at the artistic depiction of these scientific processes. The catch here is that I wasn't going to practice, and I don't think you necessarily need to practice in a traditional science setting. I specifically felt that I needed to look elsewhere because while scientists can be great communicators, and I think we've seen that here today, we aren't traditionally trained to be great communicators. And for many scientists, it's not your primary goal. So outside of this science silo, so to speak, there are those who are great communicators. And that's because that's what they focus on. That's the skill that they particularly want to develop and excel at. It's their primary function. And you can learn a great deal from them when it comes to the practical skills and also the strategies that you can employ and bring back into the science world. And so that's what I did. I took jobs in communications and in multimedia, where I learned practical skills needed to create engaging visual pieces. These weren't complex ideas. I wasn't looking at like the structure-function relationship of a protein, but the simplicity of some of these concepts helped me practice how to successfully explain just a process and also how to keep people interested. And that's something that's translational, and that you can carry into the future work that you do. The other side of that was also just working on some of the actual visual depiction of things very accurately. When it comes to medical illustrators, one of the things that we like to tout about ourselves is that we can communicate scientific processes accurately and effectively in an engaging manner. And so I need to make sure that I understand the human body, form and function of different shapes and objects, lighting, all of that fun stuff. And so even just working on sketching in community art courses and things like that over 4 years helped build my portfolio. And so for me, the result of all this was eventual success, which is why I can be here today to talk to you. And that was diving into what I would call the weird and wonderful world of medical illustration. That is some of my classmates there. We put on our hoods when we graduated to pretend that we were dementors because it's fun. But that's all good and well enough, but what exactly is medical illustration? This is the very stuffy definition from our Association of Medical Illustrators, which is the body that represents us sort of worldwide. They state that we are professional artists, advanced education in the life sciences and visual communications. Generally, I would say that we are visual problem solvers and that we conduct background research, which includes reading scientific papers and understanding the research that we're trying to communicate, meeting with scientific experts, and also like getting our hands dirty when possible. So maybe observing a surgery, getting into the lab to observe the process or procedure, so that we can effectively communicate those ideas. It might be a little bit easier to show you. It is a visual scientific communication aspect after all. So I'm going to show, not tell, and just sort of run through very quickly an example of a piece I worked on when I was completing my master's. And so this was to demonstrate the structure-function relationship between insulin and an insulin receptor and talk about the link between obesity and type 1 diabetes. I knew I wanted to convey this protein structure. I knew it needed to be accurate. I started by doing research into that, looking at what the literature actually said about that structure-function relationship and what the downstream effects were, both at a cellular and at a physiological level, because I needed to relate it back to the sort of patient empathy part and what it means for you as an individual or for us as individuals. Went into looking at what characters are necessary. And so that's what you can see on screen here, little thumbnails about who's going to be included where, what cellular characters are most important. You can see the insulin molecule from PBD up at the top there. And then taking that further and further. So starting to look at how I can refine renders of that insulin molecule, take it into more advanced 3D programs. Started in Chimera, if anyone is familiar with that. Brought it into Cinema 4D so it can make it pretty. And started adding color and thinking about how I wanted to arrange that visual narrative. The next couple slides I'm going to show are like the more exciting part. They're like, oh, how did I make this pretty spread that we'll see at the end? But what I talked about at the beginning in terms of actually doing the research is sort of the most fundamental piece of what I do. And it takes the most time as well. You need to understand that science so that you can communicate it effectively. After I did that, I could start, refining the entire spread, thinking about what it was going to look like. I wanted it to be a 2-page article, something representative for Scientific American, relatively low on the text and big on the visuals, but still to explain the process of what happens in a normal, healthy cell, and then what happens when you have insulin resistance and the receptors aren't working properly. And you can see me playing around with lighting and shapes and where I wanted to put things with the net GIF on the right-hand side. And then this is what it looked like at the end, putting it all together so that I had an effective piece, talked about diet, obesity, and type 2 diabetes that I think looks nice. I was happy with it, but that also serves as an effective tool to educate folks with an engaging sort of lens to it that helps them understand a relatively detailed process, but in a more simple and effective way. And this is only one aspect of what we do, so I won't go into as much detail here. Save that for questions. But other things that medical illustrators do are sort of more traditional illustrations. So it could be surgical illustrations like on the left, patient empathy pieces like on the right. This was part of another sort of 2-page article spread talking about a dental condition. And one of the things we definitely work on is making sure that people feel connected to the work that we're doing. And one of the ways to engage folks that way is to build on their empathy so that they can understand why it might relate to them or loved ones in their lives. And then we also get to do more editorial and fun pieces. This is one of my favorite bits, which is working on communicating science at a very quick snapshot level that gets to be a little bit more pop-sci almost. I did not actually make a cover for Scientific American. This is just a mock-up. I would love it if I get to one day do that. But this was to depict some of the benefits and some of the exciting research that's going into lab-grown meat and how you can communicate that to people who might not have, this deep scientific knowledge in a way that's immediately engaging and rewards them to look further into it, explore the image as well. And similarly, talking about rural health in Canada and its relationship to isolated and sometimes Indigenous communities as well. So this last bit is sort of how medical illustrators can help you as scientists. I also want to say that for those looking into maybe I want to do medical illustration, my pathway was just one of them. There are accredited programs, masters that help you become a medical illustrator. Definitely not the only way to do it. Like Kurtis said, and like Farah was talking about as well, practicing these skills in other ways and building up this sort of alternative skill set can help lead you into this field without necessarily needing to do the schooling that I did. You already all have scientific knowledge that you need to communicate science well. And so now it's just working on sort of the rest of your toolbox, the skill sets that you have in terms of how you want to communicate that, either through videos, talking about it, through writing about it, or through visualizing it as well. It's all Scicomm, it's just sort of different facets of that. Like I said earlier, scientists aren't always the best communicators. Programs like this are definitely helping fix that, which is phenomenal. But in general, Scicomm doesn't need to be a solo mission. Like you all have different research specialties, medical illustrators specialize in helping you effectively communicate your work. And there's other Scicomm experts as well who can help you do that in different ways. All letting scientists focus on their primary goals so that we generally achieve our broader goal, I would say, of effective science communication and increased science literacy for the general public. So that is all I have. I want to say, again, thank you for listening. Feel free to get in touch, and I will throw it back over to Brittany and Allison so that we can do a Q&A.
All right, thank you, Alex, and thank you, Farah and Kurtis. All those were really interesting, and I'm sure there were lots of I saw a bunch of little nuggets that I thought were really helpful. I'm sure we are seeing some as well for our interns. And I see, so I'll give you guys a minute to sort of type. I can hear the keyboards typing across Canada. Before I start asking questions, I want to ask sort of all three of you, because I saw this come up a few times with things like sort of entering your contest, Kurtis, and for sort of the election for features editor is this idea of having to sort of put yourself out there, just say, screw it, I'm going to go for it. And how do you sort of, I guess, psych yourself up to do that? How do you sort of get to that space where you feel like you just go for it and, give it a shot? Because I feel like that seems to be a barrier for a lot of people, is being scared to sort of go for it. And I don't know who wants to talk first, but I'd like to hear from all three of you about getting yourself to that place and doing that.
Do you want to go first? Okay, I'll go first. Yeah, psyching yourself up is actually a pretty big deal. I remember just the fact that I ran for the features editor position. Like I really had to like sit down. It's like, okay, I'm going to do the thing. I think I can do the thing. I'm going to do the thing. And the wild thing about the election was that there was actually like a candidates forum where all the candidates kind of showed up and you were asked questions. And the news editor role had 2 people running, the sports editor role had 2 people running, and then there were 5 people running for the features editor role. And it did take quite a bit of confidence to still walk into the room and just be like, I'm gonna try, like, what's the worst? And it worked out, like being okay with the risk of failure, giving it a shot, and it paid off and I was elected. And this is actually something that I keep trying to do these days. It's very easy to stay in your comfort zone and keep doing what you know, keep doing science communication to other scientists in your field, keep sharing your research with the folks who you know will love and appreciate you no matter what you do. But I found that when you kind of step outside your comfort zone, when you're nervous, when you feel anxious, when you're not sure if it's going to work out, those are usually the moments where you learn more, you get to kind of explore parts that you've never thought of, and like you just remember that the world is a lot bigger than your little bubble. So it's scary as hell, but I've always found that kind of chasing the moments that scare the hell out of me are the ones that are the best. It doesn't mean you should go cliff diving without, proper safety, but give it a shot.
I'll go next. My experience, I should say, in terms of contests, I talked about some of the ones that I won, but there's a much longer list of ones that I did not win. But in every one that I ever entered, I always found the experience to be at first very nerve-wracking, but then more often than not, every time it was just encouraging. People were there to support you. They were excited about whatever you were doing, regardless of the outcome. And I really rapidly learned, and usually it was a pretty small audience. Like I was saying, my first few YouTube videos had maybe a dozen or a couple dozen views, and like 6 of them were my family members. Like these are people that are just there to cheer you on and support you. Getting that pressing publish that first time might be a little nerve-wracking, but once you do it a couple times, it's like, no, this is okay. It's people are here for you. And then over time it grows and you feel more confident, and your viewership might grow a little bit, but those 2 things sort of the feelings never go away, but they sort of grow together, I would say. Alex?
Thank you. Yeah, similarly, so like I talked about that sort of 4-year period, the wibbly wobbly timeline part, where I was pumping myself up and learning all of these skills so that I could get into the program that I wanted to. The thing that I didn't necessarily talk about is that period I had applied multiple times and I got rejected multiple times in the program. The very first time I found out about BMC like tail end of my undergrad, so it was in the summer. Portfolios were due in December. I cobbled something together in 2 months. It was bad. It included art from high school, and it was not great. And that was quickly rejected. Second time I got an interview and then I didn't get in. And then the third time, luckily I did get an interview and I got in. But I think the big thing there was knowing that that was what I did want to do, but not letting that be the only thing. There's multiple ways to sort of get to what you want. And I think if you can identify sort of the broad endpoint, so for me, it was visualizing science. This was one way that I could do it. And as I was practicing all of those skills to get me there, I was thinking about other ways that I could branch off and still achieve the same goal. So I was looking at other programs. I was looking at how I could break into freelance. I was looking at other courses or just tutorials and things that I could do. So if you are aware of that thing that you want to do, and that's what gets you pumped up and excited, I think making sure that you're aware that it's a broad goal and it doesn't need to be one thing. There's going to be multiple ways to sort of make that, not to sound too cheesy, that dream to happen. And you can find different ways to adjust it and make it work if that's what you're really passionate about. So that was the big thing for me. It's just if I hadn't got in that third time, I don't think that I would be in a drastically different spot now. I wouldn't have gone through the program, and that would make me sad. But I would have found another way to do it because I knew that's what I wanted to do at that point.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to keep on you, Alex, because our first question's for you. So it's from Sanhita. So what advice would you give to someone with some subpar art skills? I don't think your skills are subpar. I've seen them, Sanhita. But anyway, and a PhD who wants to get into scientific illustration. I want to tap into my niche of science and do what you're doing. So what's your advice for there?
There's a few different things. Like one thing I will say, and I don't want to, I'll touch very lightly on this because I don't think that it's the be all and end all. And I don't think that folks with multiple degrees should already consider doing another one potentially. But we did have folks in my master's program who had done their PhD or had done their master's and then they decided to pursue this. And in some ways, like it is sort of one of the most straightforward and easy in that it is a course that is going to teach you how to do that. Obviously, there's like a broad other range of accessibility issues and costs that are associated with doing any graduate program. So it's not the only thing that you can do. There's a lot of tutorials online and courses that you can take, diploma programs as well, that can sort of help get you into that direction. I'll share a link in the chat, which is a website that I quite like, run by some really good medical illustrators out of the States and actually in Europe, called Learn Medical Art. And they sort of run through some of the different ways that you can get involved and teach yourself. They offer tutorials. And that's, I think, the big thing. If you're already a researcher, you can practice sort of like on yourself, so to speak, for your own figures, for your own illustrations, for your own talks that you need to do. And I think that's a really good way because it sort of like it's live prototyping and testing what you're doing. You get to test it and figure out what's working well with the audience that you might be showing it to, your lab mates, your PI, although maybe you don't want to do that right away. And then also just, other people that you're working with. And then I think if you're really interested in like that artistic side of things, try to find ways to explore it outside of science, which I think is really important. So I'm trying to like brush up on my 3D skills again. And I'm just going through a bunch of like Blender tutorials online, making like donuts and random things that have nothing to do with science, but they're fun. They get me learning. And again, it's that translational knowledge that you can then apply to the science that you're doing. So I would say just try that. Pick up a pencil, sketch when you can. I doodle during meetings all of the time. And it's just a good way to like still build those skills so that you can then hopefully bring them into the work that you're doing.
All right. Our next question is actually for Farah. I also would like to know the answer to this question. Do you have any advice for balancing multiple jobs / volunteer roles, logistically and time management wise? I think you you have, by the way, you have Quinn's dream job. And I'm not sure what job exactly they're referring to that you have, but how do you balance all of your jobs?
I feel like I'm both the best and worst example of time management. I feel like I fall in between both scales every day, but it's hard because you have to figure out what your priorities are and you really have to manage your time. And for me, this is something that I've been working on for a few years, but I think if you kind of see what I was talking about, I've always been doing science and science communication. So I've had a lot of years to always be like, I can balance both. I want to balance both. These are two priorities in my life. But as it is today, so firstly, I have two awesome bosses who trust me and they will trust me to get my stuff done. And they're not worried about checking up on me or whether I'll meet a deadline because that's something that I'll do. So it's always good to have people who believe in you and who trust you and let you do your thing. And the second thing is to really figure out what works for you. There are so many productivity hacks. Like there are planners, there are Google calendars, there's Trello, Asana, and what works for me might not work for you, and you kind of know you best. Like I have tried so many different things, but for me, it just comes down to paper and pencil. I have to write down every single thing that I need to do on a piece of paper. It's so nice to just cross it off, and that works for me, and Google Calendar to really keep track of everything. And at the end of the day, you also have to know like which deadlines are flexible and which ones are rigid. So that person who's asking you for a thing over email, do they really need it now, or can they probably wait until Monday? Or if you really need to read a document, is this necessary for today? Is it necessary for tomorrow? It's kind of figuring out which deadlines you can push and which deadlines you can make. Like today, I've planned out my day. I have different meetings, but I'm like, I really want to be at this panel. I want to talk about science communication. I want to answer your questions. It's kind of deciding what I want to prioritize. So I think it comes down to when you're building your career in Scicomm, figuring out what's important to you, what you want to do, and kind of crafting your dream job if you don't see it, kind of thing. But yes, time management is a lie. I think we're all just hanging on these days.
Yep, I agree. While I have you, I just got another quick from Quinion. So basically asking about how you have the impact assessment process for science policy and how that is or is not different from consulting, and sort of maybe is it affiliation that makes a difference, or is it sort of the process or something else?
So I guess with my impact assessment project, there are 3 different people involved. So the impact assessment project is the federal government that's looking at whether a project will impact the environment. And it's the company that's doing the project that has to participate in this process. And the federal government is like, we're double checking and we're fact checking what you're saying. And then I'm part of Evidence for Democracy. So we're like a nonprofit, nonpartisan watchdog. And we were asked by the federal government, it's like, how can we improve this process? How can we make the information that's being shared in the impact assessment process more clearer, more accessible? So you'll actually find this model a lot with the federal government. So they're probably got a process, they're doing something, and they might ask an external agency to kind of step in, address a specific gap. Maybe they don't have the capacity or the skills to address it. So kind of outsourcing the science communication help that they needed in this case, which is good. Like Alex mentioned, like Scicomm isn't a silo. You should bring in experts who have the skills to do the thing that you need at the time. But I'm sure this comes up in other workplaces too, like Kurtis or Alex. Do you ever find that you're consulting in science communication? Sorry, Britt, I took on your moderator role.
No, that's a good question. I was going to ask that.
So yes, and this is sort of funny because like the company that I work for, like my day job, is essentially a consulting company. So the work that I typically do, I don't see myself as a consultant so much, but it like, you can definitely view it through that lens. Like as a biomedical communications designer, we work with healthcare companies. A lot of my work is with pharma specifically on how to make their materials better. And we're not actually looking at like redesigning the visuals of them so much. That's what I tend to do in the freelance, but it's more so how to tell a specific story or narrative in a more effective way that actually meets the needs of end users. So like right now I'm working on a mechanism of action piece and what do doctors who are learning about this, it's a pipeline drug that's a few years out of development, what do they actually need to know about? Like what is it going to get them interested in it? And so like we are working more in a consulting role there. But again, like I don't necessarily see it as that because we are working at least on some of the designs, and we are talking to those physicians like one-on-one and also in workshops to work on all of those things. So I don't think it's a far cry though. I think maybe it depends on how you want to look at it, but I don't think that's a bad observation.
I don't get a lot of consultant requests, I wouldn't say. I think generally industries like they're still catching on to the idea that YouTube can be a professional space, because a lot of it is very much not. But I do get a lot of companies do reach out to me, being asking for sponsorships, basically being like, hey, we want people to know about, like Microsoft reached out being like, we have this initiative for the Earth, and we want people to know about our artificial intelligence for Earth platform, and we would work on a video together. We also work with other YouTubers, trying to help each other, tell their stories better. We have like a WhatsApp group basically that we're all very active on. But yeah, it's not really consultant, I wouldn't say.
All right, thanks. I have a question for Kurtis, and then I'll go back to the chat. I'm actually going to jump off of Sissy's question as well. So I remember you had the slide where you kind of, your subscriber count was pretty low and stable, and then you worked with, I think it was Scott, and then, right? And just sort of speaking to the importance of maybe mentors and collabs and those types of things. when you want to do Scicomm and you're just starting out. And then maybe after Kurtis, I'm sure Farah and Alex also have thoughts about this as well. So they will go to you guys as well. So maybe can you just talk about that a little bit, and mentoring and networking, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's in YouTube specifically, it's absolutely critical. Like it's not possible really, I've learned, to grow a YouTube channel without working with other people. And it's also not nearly as fun. I mean, you know, it can be a very lonely, sort of isolated field, which is kind of, I don't know, the opposite as to what you're doing. You're trying to like reach out to people, but at the end of the day, it can really be like, I'm in my own silo making my own videos by myself. But in doing it with other people, yeah, you share your audiences, and yeah, it grows audiences, and it's also more fun. They ask, what's the best way to approach other science YouTubers? Honestly, just send them an email. You know, go to on their about page. They'll have their email, their contact, or you can find them on Twitter. I find that like generally, if you ask people, hey, like I just want to talk to you about your channel, maybe do something with you. Usually they're pretty responsive. Keeping in mind that like the larger YouTubers get like a lot of these asks every day, but you know, reach out to small YouTubers, reach out to people that you do follow and that you already are paying attention to, and just chat them up, and yeah, and then go from there. That's my advice. Yeah, it's fun. It's more fun with people.
I would definitely echo that for like any sort of visualization aspect as well. If you like follow artists on Twitter or Instagram, you'll, I think, notice that there's like a lot of engagement and interaction within those communities. And like SciArt is a specific subset of that, but it's definitely the same sort of idea. And I think it extends to like even just how like you learn about it or learn how to be better in it. And I think this probably goes with YouTube creating and also with writing, right? Like you get better by doing those things and like seeing other people do things and getting inspired by them. BMC was an awesome program. I got to learn a lot from the profs. The most valuable part of it was my classmates and getting to like work with them and see what they did and get their critiques. And like that community has persisted after graduating and exists online on Twitter or Instagram, in some like Discord chats that we have. And I think without that, I feel like I wouldn't get any better. Like I might learn how to be more efficient in whatever program I'm learning, but without someone being able to like critique me or seeing someone make something else, I don't think I'd like get as inspired. It's much more fun to see what other people are doing and be like, oh, that's something that I can try, or I really want to try and like emulate that style, or that didn't work so well, but how can I make it better? So I think collaborating with other people, with other researchers, with other visualizers, storytellers in general is like absolutely essential. And if you ever do want to sort of monetize it as well, I do think it then becomes a big thing. The only way you're going to find clients and people to work with and work for if you're freelancing is through being social and networking on those sites. So even just starting small conversations on Twitter and making sure you're following folks who interest and inspire you is like a good first step to take.
I will third that. I think Twitter is pretty important. That's how I met a lot of folks and did a lot of the things, like especially if you're a graduate student or postdoc, your world is kind of restricted to the labs that you're in, the departments that you're in, the emails that are coming in. But by jumping on something like Twitter, you're following a lot of different folks. You can see a lot of different opportunities. Like I only found out about projected futures and ended up meeting Brittany as a result. It was because of a random tweet that I saw on Twitter. I was like, okay, I think I want to go to the science journalism course. So definitely follow Twitter, follow the people who are doing the things that you're interested in, but also follow people outside to make sure that you're not creating a little echo chamber of your own. And other than social media, there are a lot of different Slack groups and communities that exist for science communicators. So I'm going to plug Massive Science. Massive Science is a science media outlet. They have a consortium, which is full of a lot of budding science writers. So if you're kind of looking for a space where you want to write about science, you can pitch openly in Massive Science. You can get feedback from editors, and you can really improve your Scicomm skills through that. There are Slack groups like the Scicomm Network Slack. There is also an art-related one that I don't remember. I will remember and drop it in. But these are kind of spaces where you can meet other folks who you might not find on your own. As for reaching out to folks, like definitely reach out to science communicators that you're interested in speaking to, that you have questions for, I get a lot of these and I always answer any questions that I can give to folks. And because I get a lot of questions, I actually ended up writing a beginner's guide to science communication opportunities that I'm going to drop in the chat, which really lists a lot of the different Scicomm opportunities that are here in Canada that you can use to network, volunteer, and get started on your own too. But yes, collaboration is key.
Thanks, Farah. And you wrote one for policy too, right? Like a similar, was it for policy? Not yet?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, would you mind? Yeah, because there's a question asking for, like, that would be answered by exactly that link. So while Farah's doing that, I'm going to ask the million-dollar question that me and Allison always have with this sort of stuff. So a little bit of a change in vibe here, but I think it's important to have this conversation. So all three of you have done some kind of research at some point. You know, you did some kind of science research, right? Master's, undergrad, thesis, whatever. So did you share or tell your PI, so you're the boss of your lab for those of you who are unaware, or research supervisors that you were doing Scicomm stuff? Allison thinks it's great. I think it's great. But some colleagues and supervisors that I've had even discourage their students from doing these non-research activities and how it's sort of, you know, it's taking time away from research or whatever. And I just want to hear sort of your experiences with that kind of stuff and maybe how you navigated that if that happened and sort of that sort of thing. Because I think that's something that a lot of Scicommers do end up running into, and it's tricky to deal with. So I don't know who wants to go first, but go for it.
Yeah, I'll dive into that. I started doing science communication about my master's without really thinking too much about it. This contest came up to like do a science slam, like a 2-minute, 3-minute video about your thesis, and I just kind of did it on a weekend. I made a music video about my thesis, like recorded the music, and then put it out the next day. And I didn't really think too much of it. And then it like the University of Guelph like newspaper made an article about it, and then I didn't expect to win, but I won this whole thing. And then I was like, oh, I'm going to be gone for a month on this trip to Europe. Hopefully I'll be submitted my thesis by then, but I don't know. And I was like, I need to tell my advisor about this because like I'm going to be gone. And yeah, he was super supportive. You know, he wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to, you know, I think he was a little worried at first that I was using my lab time to like make these videos, but I was like, no, you know, that's not the case. Like, and I'm still on track for all of the things. And once he kind of caught wind of, you know, he basically a bunch of articles came out about like his lab, and this was great for him, right? It's good to be able to show in terms when you're doing funding rounds, it's good to be able to show that you're having an impact in the community and that, you know, people know about you. So I think once he kind of got his head around that, he was super supportive. Yeah, so I wish I'd communicated it sooner. I honestly didn't, it just didn't cross my mind. I didn't think it was a big deal.
I think it was similar for me. Like, I was just doing science communication during my master's. It wasn't that I was hiding, it was just that I knew that it wasn't like my prof was very focused and kind of, we were a very new lab, we were kind of getting set up, we were getting started, so I knew that his priorities were something else. And I just made sure that it didn't conflict with the stuff that I was doing in my lab. But I guess accidentally, I think my prof kept finding out about things that were happening, and he would just like, oh, look at who's in the news, and he would drop it at like a news link. I'm like, oh yeah. I forget that, you know, the news will reach the broader world. And my supervisor wasn't bothered as long as like I was just getting things done and meeting deadlines. The few times that I did kind of ask for explicit permission was like if I'm going away for a conference, if I want to be away for like a week or something, then I would just be like, is it okay if I take a week off? I'm using my holiday time and all of that. And he was always fine with it. And I think towards the end, my supervisor actually realized that I was kind of really good at the science communication thing. So right before I graduated, he actually asked me to create a Twitter account for the lab. We were about to launch this Nature paper, and he asked me to kind of draft some tweets. So we kind of began using some of those Scicomm skills. And he was like, Farah, can you help us out here to do? So I think I slowly brought the power of Twitter and Scicomm into our lab. And now it's kind of a standard in our lab, that if a paper is going to be released, you're going to kind of sit down, think about how you want to share it with the world, what's going to go in the press release, what's going to go on Twitter accounts. So kind of slowly embedding those Scicomm skills. So yeah, I didn't explicitly tell my supervisor, but that's because I knew that it wasn't a concern and that he wasn't worried about what I was doing in my off time. And I think it's different from everyone. Some supervisors are stricter, some supervisors aren't. And if an honest conversation is the easiest way to address any concerns or worries that you might have, it's better to have that conversation. And at the end of the day, you want to make sure you're getting your research done. And if you ever take time out of the lab to do Scicomm, just come in earlier, make sure you meet your deadlines, like just make sure things are staying on track.
I have a little less to add here, mostly because I think when I started thinking about Scicomm, it was like tail end of my thesis. And so I didn't really talk about it with my supervisor at the time, who knows. When I was doing that, though, I do think that I did a little bit of like asking for forgiveness, not permission, in terms of the amount of time I did spend on some things, which pros and cons. Like I spent a lot more time on my thesis presentation because I wanted to make like really engaging graphics and make it so that it was useful for not just my PI, who I knew was going to be there, but it was part of like a larger symposium where there would be other undergraduates, family members, and people who weren't, well equipped with a science lexicon to understand some of those things. And I did it because I wanted to. It was at the end and I could, so that's not necessarily the greatest story. But what I would say is that there is like this increasing amount of literature as well about the importance of Scicomm, scientific literacy, and its importance in teaching education. And like, if you ever feel like you do need to sort of like prove why it's important, or you feel like your efforts in that area are being undervalued, there is evidence to support what you're doing. And so I'm not saying to like present a case to your PI, but I think that it is something that you could slowly introduce and say like, there are other researchers doing this and other opportunities to collaborate, to test things, to figure out like what you're doing and making sure it's effective. I think the thing that always struck me through my undergrad when we were learning about things, and we had a scientific literacy course in the program that I was part of, is that like good science isn't good unless it's communicated well. You can come up with a great discovery, and unless it's shared in a way that is accessible and engaging to folks, it doesn't really, like, it's not that it doesn't matter, but folks aren't going to know about it, and what impact is it going to have? So I think there's this like huge argument for how important it is, and there is a lot of evidence to support that. So if at any point it does feel undervalued, try and find those around you who agree, and make a case for it if you can, because it's important.
Yeah, and just not to sort of insert myself, but just because I've had a slightly different experience. So I've had the sort of prototypical PI send me the email saying, you're spending too much time on this stuff. I'm concerned, blah, blah, blah. So what I did in that case is I just, exactly what Alex was talking about, just sort of reply with, the evidence that, one, you're not falling behind in your research, and maybe a little bit about why what you're doing is important, what why it's useful. Maybe if you've gotten awards or anything like that, that's a good way to sort of make the argument that I'm good at this stuff and it's worthwhile. Because that's something that PIs, particularly older ones, don't always understand science communication. It's a relatively new field. New things are scary for older people, or older-minded people, I should say. And that's something that you just stick to your guns. Ask for forgiveness, not permission. Remember that your supervisor is your supervisor for your job, which is 35 hours a week, or let's say officially. They're not your supervisor for your life. So that would be my advice. Just because I want to make sure we sort of mention that sometimes what to do when they're not supportive, which isn't always the case. But yes, thank you for talking about that, everybody, because I think that's something that's really important. Something that I think scares a lot of people into getting into Scicomm is, what will the boss say about this stuff? But okay, so moving on to happier things. I'm waiting on some typing, some questions. So what I want to sort of maybe talk about now is maybe get into some more things about maybe where are you guys going? And this is a hard question, but maybe where do you guys see yourselves in maybe the next, let's say, 5 years? Given how Scicomm is changing, how the world has changed, how science communication became suddenly, the spotlight was on for the last, 15 months or whatever it's been, how important it is to communicate science well for the general public? Where do you guys maybe see the field going? Where do you guys see you guys going? And then, in the short term, as best as you can tell, because as we've all seen from all three of your presentations, it's very much sort of like a random walk where you end up in this field, right? So I don't know, whoever wants to start first. I don't think Alex has started first yet. So maybe do you want to start first, Alex, and we can go to Kurtis and Farah?
Sure. I'm laughing because, oh gosh, 5 years. I really like the job I do now. I don't think I'll probably be there in 5 years. I think that's like relatively common for folks in my industry, and for it being like a bit of a consulting agency. One of the reasons is because I think I've learned a lot about how to work with the end user in mind, but I do miss making stuff day to day. So like I said, we don't do a lot of that right now. A lot of it is like the design thinking behind products, and I miss making the pretty things that I showed in my presentation. So where does that lead me? I don't entirely know. I've been floating the idea of like, do I want to do more freelance? Because you have this like abundance of different projects that you can do. You get to choose who your clients are. That's like the positive way of spinning it. The less positive way of spinning it is you have to find clients, and you have less variable, or much more variable, I should say, income associated flat, but that is a thought. There are more production agencies for what I do as well. So you can work for essentially what would be like a marketing company, but for pharma and healthcare. So a pharma company might go to them to say, like, we need you to animate this molecular interaction, this MOA, mechanism of action of how a drug works, or make this cover for us, or this article for us for Nature, for Science, for Life, like you name it. There's also like what I actually did my master's research on, which I didn't talk about at all, but was actually simulators to help healthcare providers learn how to perform surgeries. And there's companies who do some of that as well. So the modeling and the procedural steps that would go into how to do a VR operation, or something like that. So there's a lot of different things that I'm potentially thinking about. I'm weirdly even floating around the idea of going back to school. I said that I never wanted to go into research, but then I realized that I could research this and I could teach the things that I am really passionate about and teach Scicomm, and like that now gets me really excited. So I think the exciting part about the next 5 years is that there's a lot of different options, there's a lot of different things that I could do, and I feel like well equipped, and that it's just like an exciting time to be involved in it because there are so many options and so many different things that you can do in the Scicomm space. So it's not a great answer because I don't have a definitive one, but I guess at least I'll leave it with that it's exciting and that there's a lot of things you can do.
Do you want to go for it?
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, also hard for me since I've taken such a windy path, but I think, well, I started 2020 in January being like, I'm going to make a documentary about climate change and I'm going to do it across Canada on a bicycle, and I couldn't do that. But now I'm thinking, it would be nice to do something more long form, especially now that things are reopening and I'm able to do something like that. So yeah, I'm probably going to do more long form, maybe a documentary or maybe some sort of book, I'm thinking. I'm just kind of getting a little bit tired of 10-minute videos. It's like you can only fit so much in at a time. So that's one thing. In terms of the industry, one maybe silver or copper lining in this whole pandemic is that I think there are more people that are starting to think about like, oh, science communication is really important and we need to value this. So I'm kind of hopeful that we might see more investment in this in the next few years. And then lastly, in terms of my style and approach, I want to be focusing more on not excluding the science, but focusing more on how it feels to think about things and how it feels to think about climate change, and sort of approach it as at a more emotional and personal level, because I think that can help people really connect with science and with the things we're talking about. Yeah, that's me. Farah.
So the next 5 years, I guess looking at Canada in terms of science communication, I think we're doing better. We've seen in the pandemic just how important science communication is. We've seen how important effectively talking about risk is also. So I think these are things that are going to continue on. There's more funding coming in to support science communication skills. So things such as the NSERC grant for science communication skills that's supporting this program. There are a lot of programs that are focused on skills, but I think we're moving the dial on training and skills building, at least in scientists. What I'm now worried is kind of about the sustainability of science communication. So who's paying science communicators? Who's paying the trainers who are doing the science communication? How do you help people, whether they're scientists or non-scientists, who are trying to build a sustainable career out of this? How do you ensure that people are being compensated for the time and they're not just volunteering and doing work for free or for exposure to build a portfolio? So there's growth, but there are challenges to whether this will be sustainable. And that's one bucket. In terms of how I fit in, I guess for me, it's now all happening. It's all become more urgent. There's this backdrop of systemic racism. There is climate change, the consequences that we're seeing very in front of us. So for me now, I'm kind of shifting towards looking at where the gaps are, looking at where I can really make small incremental change, and not just sticking to echo chambers and just really thinking about, okay, this is somewhere where I can be useful. This is somewhere where I can address change. So just to give an example, when we're talking about pay, there's no transparent resource that actually tells you like, how much should I charge for a workshop or panel? How do I ask and how do I get these resources? So thanks to Twitter, I actually ended up joining this effort, 3,500 Women Scientists, where we did a survey, we crowdsourced honorariums that people have received for talks, workshops, panels, keynotes, all of that. We got over 700 responses. We've collected like over 1,000 honorariums. And now I'm kind of analyzing that data, and we're building this transparent resource that anyone can kind of look at and just be like, hey, I'm in Canada, I have a master's, I've been invited to give a talk. This is what people have been paid. This is what people in different fields have been paid, and kind of giving people the tools so that they can advocate for pay. So that's just an example of me kind of saying like, there's only so much that I can talk and complain about a problem. At some point, you kind of think it's like, okay, who can actually address this? And you realize that it's you. You're the one who has the power and the skills to address it. So in 5 years, I don't know where I'll be, but at least for now, my focus is on kind of the issues that I care about and that I'm complaining about. Maybe I'm the one who can do something to address it.
All right, so I'm cognizant of the time. I think we're gonna have to wrap. So thank you, all three of you. That was a really exciting, interesting panel. I think everyone got a lot out of it. And maybe, is there anything you want to say, Allison?
Nope, this was sort of our last session. So we ended on a really strong note, and I think it was super, super fun. It was really nice to hear everybody's personal stories. And, you know, I think what we sort of wanted the interns to get out of this session was all things are possible. You just, you know, sometimes it's just not knowing that things are options. And so that's another reason why networking and connecting with people can be really helpful for that reason as well, to know, oh, I can make my own career with these kinds of aspects, and this is a job, and I can get paid to do something that I really love and enjoy. That's important.